Just to start the discussion, I will play the devil's advocate. So, I have a couple of comments and one question. The first is, let's start from the end of 19th century. So, Germany tries to be imperialist, at least in Africa. It tries, it gets only a couple of colonies. When the US, it's not even a colonial power. I mean, it's just there as a representative, okay, at the Berlin Conference in 1885. The second point.
Hold on.
Yeah.
What are you saying about the US's land empire?
The US is not yet so imperialist, only after the First World War.
But that is forgetting one very important fact.
Yes.
It has a continent.
Yeah, of course.
So that's I'm just going to say that. Okay. All right. Just as long as we have that. Okay.
Of course. Then we have geography playing a role, but in my eyes, in my view, it plays a role also within the US. For example, Germany was unified by Bismarck as well in welfare terms. I mean, it provided welfare. Public goods to the people. So it tries to incorporate the working class movement. While in the US, we have a division between the North and the South. And the Civil War is won by the North, so by the progressive forces. In Germany, it's the other way around, because you have, of course, very strong extremes. You have very strong working, as you said, with SPD being the model for working class in the early 20th century. And you have, on the other hand, a division within the country, horizontal, that's what I mean, so class division. Class divisions are much more difficult to deal with than with the geographical divisions, because when you have like a very clear picture, so what is the North, what is the South, and if the North wins, then I mean this sets a dynamic. You understand what I'm trying to say?
There's a lot to what you're saying, yes.
Yes.
Keep going, please.
Okay. The next is about the method. So when you have, I'm an economics historian, so when we use econometrics, and we have what we call dummy variables, so variables that where you respond yes or no. So federal government, yes to the US as well. This, no, etc. This is a bit, I guess in your book it's not like this. I mean, you need to present it in an hour. So in the book, of course, it will be more analytical. But there is the danger of overseeing crucial differences. That we have federal systems, but in the case of Germany, as you said, it's quite centralized after a point. So, I mean, this bureaucracy that is developed and this centralization makes things difficult. I'm just emphasizing also the internal factors, basically, just to have a debate. And then, no, I should stop and then come back later. So I have my thoughts more clear. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, no, these are really, should I take a couple questions or just, how do we do this?
Yeah, start with this and then...
Okay, thanks very much, first of all. All those I think are very strong critiques of the kind of argument that I'm putting forward here. So on the thing about empire, I think we already had that discussion. I would say, you know, we have to take account of the fact that the US, even if it's not a formally imperial power, it has this, you know, this vast area which is available to it. So we shouldn't get too, I think, worked up in a sense about the formal question of imperialism or non-imperialism. If we look at what the US has, it has an internal empire of quite impressive extent. On the geographical division, I think I actually agree with what you're saying, but I think it goes along with what I'm saying. What you suggested is that class divisions are very hard to deal with, which is my point, actually. That is to say that, in a way, the US, the whole point about the US is that it's able essentially to outflank and weaken its working class.
Outsource, yeah.
That's the point. There are a number of mechanisms by which that happened. I think the regionalization argument that you raise is an important one. But then you also made another important point, which I think was probably more critical, and this was the idea that there was a profound difference between German unification and the American Civil War. And the way that you put it was to say, well, in German unification was carried out basically by those forces that were analogous to the Southern plantocracy in the American Civil War. So the side, it was the different sides win. That's a very venerable argument. Essentially, that's Barrington Moore's argument, I would say. I guess I would push back on that by saying, it really depends on what you mean by one. And the reason I say that it depends on what you mean by one is that it is in no sense the case that the plantocracy in the American South ceased to exist as a social force. It very much was still a social force, and you know the evidence for that is it's clear in Jim Crow and in the nature of that whole system. So we have here to discuss the question of what the real character of the Junker elite was with relationship to the plantocracy. And on that question, I think I would say if you thought about them as social groups, somehow comparing them that way, I think it's hard to argue that the Junkers were particularly more backward than the Southern planters who were basically, based in sharecropping and squeezing, right?
Just one follow-up element, because I think it will help to understand what I'm trying to say. So, by having this division in the US, it's easier for the North to create a mainstream culture, because it defends itself and distinguishes itself from the South, while in Germany it's much more complex on local level.
Okay, so what I would say, that's a really interesting argument.
Like outsourcing, do you know what I mean?
I think you're making a really interesting argument, but what I would say is that I think what it does is it, by essentially having this South, what it does actually is it really takes pressure off of the American dominant class, which never has to face, these two groups of peasants and workers. There's no possibility of them linking up in really any way to threaten the ruling elite. So I think I'm agreeing with what you're saying, but maybe I'm giving it a slightly different interpretation, although I'm not sure that we actually disagree that much on these things. In terms of the dummy variables and the danger of basically overfitting the explanation to these two cases, so there may be a disagreement about the nature of method here. I mean, what you're referring to is this general idea that there may be many other differences between these cases that we're not accounting for because you only have two. And I guess my response to that would be, I have tried to build the comparison in relationship to the main theoretical debates, right? So I'm not trying to say, in a sense, that these two cases are in the abstract comparable or ontologically comparable, whatever that might mean. But I think we can learn something from the comparison in relationship to articulated theoretical alternatives that I tried to lay out. So that's kind of my methodological strategy, and you're right, I will have much more to say about that in the book, where there'll be also more cases. But thank you very much for your questions.
For the lively presentation.
Thank you.
So who would like to ask any question? Okay. Somebody. So I have to ask something. I would like to. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So my question is that. So we could argue that, that the states who did not have, like the United States, an inner land to occupy, they were forced because of the social polarization to imperialist adventures and this to some extent explains the rise of fascism. I mean, this is the explanation. It's a question.
I think so. I think that's a good summary of it. Yeah. I mean, does it explain the rise of fascism? Let me not say that. Let me say it explains why they could not become liberal democracies.
Okay.
I actually think the rise of fascism as a thing is a very complicated and overdetermined thing that has to do with lots of different factors, many of which I've written about before. But yeah, I mean, and you know, even really particular personalities, I mean, you can't really understand the German, you can't really understand the rise of Nazism without Hitler. It's a very peculiar thing. But you can understand why it was incredibly difficult for Germany to have anything like the US evolution, right? That's basically, so I would pull back from that a little bit and just say, okay, let's do that, right? Not say that I'm really having a full explanation for fascism per se. What I'm trying to say, generally speaking, is that the real puzzle is democracy. It's capitalist democracy. How is that possible? That's the question that I'm trying to ask, or I'm trying to raise that as the question that perhaps we should be really most worried about. Perhaps authoritarianism has never been a particular puzzle. Perhaps that's kind of the natural mode of capitalism to some extent. Anyway, that goes a little beyond what I was saying, but just to be, have some discussion here.
Because I'm thinking that, to your scheme, also the Greek case may fit to the extent that, there was the war with Turkey, 1992 from 1999 and 1922, sorry. So the inability, of the Greek bourgeoisie to expand abroad, led, to internal crisis of democracy that ended up to, μεταξύ regime. That, this was, makes sense somehow. Because you have in Greece the same, internally recurring political crisis with several coups, etc., etc. And I agree to a certain extent that is, the inability of the bourgeoisie, to a certain extent to absorb the social demands from below. And of course this could be possible through an expansion to abroad, to Turkey, because this was the whole thing, to markets there, but to the extent that it was not possible, there was an internalist thing and also an internalist discourse, and this is somehow peculiar, because, Μεταξάς, who was to a certain extent fascist, had an inner world looking about, imperialism. He was against the war in Asia Minor. And the liberals, like Venizelos, were pro, the war. That this is a very strange contradiction. A fascist to be,
Well, you could say Franco is another similar.
Is it really a contradiction?
Yeah, this is.
So it's very interesting what you're saying about the Greek case, and I need to read your book. So but I would say generally speaking, we must obviously think about the interaction between geopolitics and internal factors. Like it's not. I don't want to say like it's just geopolitics. That's not. It's the way in which, as you're suggesting, it's the way in which these geopolitical things shape class alliances, most particularly, and then what I'm suggesting is capacity or lack of capacity of the bourgeoisie basically to make a hegemonic claim vis-a-vis the working class. I think that's key, and that's the kind of Gramscian thing that I want to kind of emphasize.
And if I may say something, George, about the Greek case. I'm not so sure that imperialism is the kind of like driving force or ideology in the case of the efforts of Greek expansion, because I'll say nationalism and the kind of like crisis of national integration, which is very close historically, 1913, 1914 till up 1917. That's also, I think that's a strongest factor, at least ideologically speaking, rather than imperialism proper. Per se, because there are all the conditions of imperialism are not And I have a question, but of course first Kulan, and then Kostas, and then everybody else.
It's just
I'll be the
a
last.
brief clarification question that I forgot. When you talked about tariffs, you meant tariffs on exports, US and Germany exports.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. I will just change later.
Okay.
Costa?
It was just some thoughts. Dylan, I'm sorry I couldn't follow you from the beginning because due to another obligation. But still, following the second part of your presentation, I wondered, did Germany actually follow the path that led to authoritarian capitalism? Yes, but still, this lasted for 12 years. And I mean, Barrington wrote his book in 1966. The Second World War ended in 1945, and now we are 60 years away from 1966. So you see, if you put all this in a different context, historical context, in a broader context, I really liked your comment and your argument about the geopolitics. But it's not about Germany and the United States. I mean, a better probably comparison would be between the United States and China, or which is actually a different path, even now.
Yeah.
For a longer period. I mean, Germany was a different path for quite a short period. I mean, they adapted.
I'll learn Mandarin and then. No, it's a very that's a really, really important. It's a very important point. So all I'm going to say about that, though, is that there is one factor, which is the U.S. It's the U.S.'s victory in the Second World War is a decisive consequence for the whole subsequent evolution of democracy on the European continent, not just for Germany, but I think for the continent as a whole, I would say. And I'm not saying this because I'm a huge patriot, but I'm going to say, the U.S. hegemony is really, really important for this, and I think it interferes in a rather profound way with our whole understanding of the capitalist democracy relationship. That is to say, sure, it seems like there's a very natural and comfortable relationship with capitalism and democracy, provided that you have, this enormous security umbrella, and of course, a determined attempt and a very, very intentional attempt to reconstruct all of the major European powers along basically liberal democratic lines. So I think that actually, if we think about it in a broader context, it actually reinforces the point I'm making to some extent, which is the general point about the importance of the geopolitical environment. But it's a great question. I mean, it's a very powerful question. And the China one is, I'd love to do that. But I like to at least, somewhat know the languages of the areas I'm talking about.
Because now the tide has changed. I mean, the geopolitical, let's say, Lebensstrom.
Living space or spazio vitale, whatever we're going to call that.
It's limited for the West right now.
Yeah.
So
what's going on?
We're going to autocracy.
Well, but I hate to say this, but that seems to confirm my main point. So, I'm not, I appreciate what you're saying. I just think it's grist to my mill, as they say in English. So,
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I'm thinking a lot about what you're saying. And I don't have really conclusions, but I just want to bring in one point, one observation. And I wonder why you didn't talk about the First World War. Because the First World War and the defeat of the German Reich in the First World War, I'm supporting actually your argument, but I think this is particular situation in Germany. The defeat of the German Reich in the First World War created a revanchist politics of the German elites, because they lost territory in the east, in Poland. So the Junkers and the German military, which is, like, let's say, the generals and the commanders of the German military come from the Junker background because of historical reasons. So this particular social class in German society lost the First World War. They lost territory. And they developed a revanchist politics towards the, to Poland or to the east to regain these territories. And I think if you talk about democracy and authoritarianism, or in the German case, democracy or National Socialism, fascism at war, we have to see this, this factor, which is very important, because the anti-democratic forces of the Weimar Republic were created by the First World War. The Reichswehr, the Junkers, but also the fact that the military crashed the intent of a socialist revolution in the end of the First World War, created mobilization of practically a pre- or a proto-fascist movement against the communist uprising, against the Spartacus uprising, against the formation of the communist movement and the council movement. So these two things created this anti-democratic atmosphere of the Weimar Republic, which could lead to the establishment of an authoritarian state, and both have to do with the First World War. So I'm kind of supporting the argument that we have to see the geopolitics, because the First World War, of course, and the loss of territory has to do with geopolitics. But I think it's a very particular situation in Germany.
Yeah, I think that's a really, you know, I think those are very good points. I mean, I think the key question, the First World War is not, I mean, I should probably have said more about the First World War. It's not external to what I'm talking about. I think the question is, because there are two German projects of political expansion, really. There's the land project and the Juncker-based project that you're suggesting. But there's also then the naval project, which is a kind of a more bourgeois industrial project, which is also a very important element, both in pushing Germany toward the First World War, but I think, you know, that element is also still around in the Weimar Republic. So I'm not convinced that the German bourgeoisie is particularly democratic in either period. I mean, I guess it's possible that under Stresemann, a kind of more pacific incorporation of the German government into the European context was perhaps a possibility. But it strikes me that there were that Germany's problem with empire, as you are suggesting yourself, after the First World War was even more acute because they lost all their empire, whatever empire they had, than it had been under the empire itself. So I think both Germany's engagement in the First World War and then the outcome of that tend to suggest that this geopolitical factor was always incredibly important. Now then the question becomes what the role of the Junkers was as a particular social group in pushing to the east. And there, that's a good point. That's what I will say about that. I need to think more about that. I guess my sense is that the kind of I'm not sure how much of this is driven by kind of fantasies of having an American-style empire, and how much of it is driven by kind of, land hunger. Those are the kind of issues that I think are really important to think about. But certainly the tariff politics become even more fraught under the Weimar Republic even than they had been in the late 19th century. So, Germany's, the fact that Germany is so productive and modern is not doing anything at all to help it along the path to democracy in the Weimar period, in my way of thinking about these things. But I appreciate that comment very much.
If I can also ask something, so if we go back to the question of imperialism, what does imperialism do exactly in the countries under examination? Does it allow a formation of a working class that gradually becomes better off and pushes for rights and pushes more and more and more? Does it allow a working class that gets gradually more educated and therefore more familiar to the idea of rights, and therefore having sort of like ways to kind of like exercise pressure to the bourgeoisie? Does it create a different circulation of goods and therefore creates a sort of like the kind of like beginning, let's say the sources of later consumerism? What is exactly, how do we look at it? What is the effect of imperialism precisely within, what's the kind of like relationship that we're looking at?
And also here, very close to what Rosa says, there's the notion of labor aristocracy that Hobsbawm uses, and in order to say that, also the internal division of the working class, to a certain extent, is also relies on the imperialist expansions. It is something that has been,
And I think Leoniki also wants to add something.
Just first, the response would be it creates economies of scale. So afterwards, of course, he will reply. but I guess all these paths you described can be reality depending where and when. Depending on the context. So it does both. Like via industrialization, especially. As Asimov and Robinson said, and even other scholars, either they look at it from a, from a neo-institutionalist view or from another perspective. It's true that they are connected, like industrialization and the formation of the working class. And it's true also that because the welfare investments within the metropole increase, because there is, wealth, more wealth is created, so more the budget is expanding, so welfare investments, yes, lead to maybe more educated working class, etc. So I guess I can see all these paths. What do you think?
Right. You mean all these causal pathways from imperialism to the outcome? Yeah. No. I think these are they're all plausible. I guess I've been very influenced ultimately by Hobsbawm's argument. Now, Hobsbawm's argument is basically, as I understand it, is the following. In an internationally competitive environment, the main function of the British Empire was to absorb what were essentially non-competitive industrial goods. And therefore to maintain employment and incomes at a higher level than would have been possible otherwise. So it's probably this access, I think that it is probably the access to markets that is the key thing. I'm not so much, I'm pretty not convinced about the idea that it's about extracting kind of goods and like giving them to the working class or something. I don't think that is the mechanism that's really at play here. But I do think that there's an access to markets thing which is important. And I also think, and my thinking on this is not entirely crystal clear. So you guys have basically nailed, I think, the main analytic weakness of the piece so far. But I do think there's I think the ideological part is really important. I think this idea of having a kind of a great state, a first-class power, is it's harder to kind of develop evidence on that one, but that strikes me as perhaps imperialism's main role in sort of demobilizing, de-radicalizing the working class. And here I think it's certainly the failure of that in both the Italian and the German cases. That's very obvious to me. I actually think that Italian and German, trajectories are an expression of the inability of the working class or inability of the bourgeoisie to mobilize its working class around a nationalist project, paradoxically. That's really the key problem in those two cases. Now, I think there's another question that is raised by this discussion that I don't totally know what the kind of answer to is, but maybe the problem is that the nation state is just not the right unit of analysis for understanding capitalist economies. And of course the US is not really a nation, it's not really a nation state, I don't think. It's a continent. And that is an issue, right? So that allows for a level of division of labor and so on that is kind of not attainable in the European context. So that may be just a factor that needs to be more carefully theorized. Yeah. Sorry, I wish I had more to say on these issues, but that's kind of my thinking on it.
Good luck. Ask any other question? I think I have another one. Yes, I don't know. This is a personal thought about. I mean, what type of the thing is that I have always. I was wondering about the type of, what type of liberal democracies were, the interwar ones. Because in most of the cases, there were, democratic, electoral regimes that did not really have any interest of, absorb substantially, the social demands from below. There were, let's say, notable democracy. There were. So I'm just wondering if, the internal crisis of interwar period is also exactly because the democratic function, was not really so much effective in the sense that, for example, in the Greek case, I don't think that the bourgeois parties, royalists or the liberal party could really, they were not really practically interested about what the working class was doing. So it was somehow much more absorbed with their own stuff rather than what's going on to the reality of society. This is why we ended up to a kind of derailment of liberal democracy. Do you think that this makes any sense as a explanation?
Yes, I think it makes a lot of sense as an explanation. If I'm understanding, I guess the way that I would think about what you're suggesting is that it was incredibly difficult, basically, to make this transition from restricted oligarchic liberalism to liberal democracy. I think that's true. I think it's true virtually everywhere, but then that imposes this whole question of, well, how was it possible? How is it that you can actually have you know, in a way, I think the question you're posing is actually the question about the relationship between capitalism and democracy. Because the question is, well, how can you have an extensive suffrage regime? You know, how can you move from the restricted censitary regimes to mass democracy? And I guess my basic answer is to say, whether they cared about the working class or they didn't care about the working class, the point was that extending such suffrage under conditions in which you hadn't, in fact, political vehicles that would effectively incorporate the working class was going to lead to a crisis, was going to lead to a reversion, essentially an authoritarian path to modernization, say. And that's basically the argument that I'm making. So. Crisis of hegemony.
Yeah. So in reality, exactly because the communist parties, or in reality, challenge this type of. They, to a certain extent, they succeed absorbing this kind of demand that the political system could not really deal with it. They work. So.
Yeah, I don't think that it's very easy. I mean, it's kind of what you were saying. I actually think that class conflict is very difficult to manage in a democracy. And so the question is, you know, how is it that has been possible, right? Which I think is basically, that's the question that you're posing. How do you get this transition from these restricted? I mean, obviously, the logical way of combining liberalism with capitalism is to restrict suffrage, right? That's the kind of, that makes sense. But in fact, we don't have that. In fact, we have this paradox of extensive suffrage plus monopoly of property ownership. How is that possible?
This is why now we are talking all the time about the identity politics, because it's much easier than class politics. I believe that until my death.
And also regarding your argument about democracy as a byproduct of the pressure from below, as a conquest of the working class, etc. You don't think that it's a question that the working class and the expansion of the working class from 1880s onwards was a way, and a compromise, historical compromise from above, but it was a reality at the same time. They couldn't do in which ways they could not really offer this electoral democracy. There were some demands, because social democracy and other social democratic parties, as far as I know, they were struggling for this as a political demand. They were saying, that this is, and of course, other people say that this does not make sense, but it could be like this. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good. This is essentially. I wish Jeff Ely was here. This is his argument, basically.
Okay.
But I guess what I would say about that is, look, first, it's if you look at the history of suffrage, it's hard in a sense. You have these concessions from very conservative, Disraeli, Bismarck, Napoleon III, Giovanni Giolitti. These are the people. These are the great democratizers, right?
Yeah.
In a sense, right? In maybe a general way, they're responding to pressures from below, but they're the lesson that Bismarck, of course, is, and also the lesson of Giolitti, is that's a mistake. They turned out to be quite wrong about what they thought extending democracy was going to be, because Bismarck had this weird idea that the working class was going to be naturally monarchist. He had no idea that he was unleashing the gate to the largest, socialist party in history, right? And Giolitti was exactly the same. Now, Disraeli was able to do it, but of course it's all about this is kind of going back to my point, of course. I mean, the British working class had been, at that point, incorporated with powerful social imperialism. So I don't want to overstate the argument in a way and say, oh, the working class is totally irrelevant, they don't care about that. That's not true. But it's also the case that this transition is extremely delicate and dangerous for the property-owning elite, right? And it's not a kind of a natural just outcome. Does that clarify the position a little bit? Okay.
Any other question? Okay. So, thank you, Dylan.
Thank you guys very much. It was really, really great to hear your comments. Appreciate the opportunity to talk.
Our next seminar is on 10th of May, and we'll have with us Paschal Matalas, and his topic will be about nationalism and fascism in Greece in the beginning of 20th century.
Oh,
So, yeah.
interesting.
I also have another announcement. Hold on a second, everyone. Before we go, because May seems really far away, but we have something else in the meantime. And we may have something, the second thing, but we don't have a set date. We're going to have a mini conference on the emergence of the new far right. So it's about the emergence of the new far right, networks, identities, and strategies of communication here in the office on the 19th, 20th, and 21st of April from 5:30 to 9:30. And the first day will be dedicated to networks, counter movements, and how these counter movements were critical to the contemporary formation of the alt-right. Let's say the second day will be dedicated on gender and class, and the third day is going to be dedicated to the media and social media. We'll circulate that, and we'll be waiting for you. Thank you.